We are often told that history is written by the victors. But I want to tell you a different story. A story that suggests history isn't just written, it's forged. It's forged in fire and steel, paid for with coin, and whitewashed with influence. This is the story of a name that should be a whisper of warning, but instead became a titan of industry. This is the story of a shadow that never faded, a legacy of power that survived war, judgment, and even morality itself. This is the story of the Von family. Our tale begins not in a grand boardroom, but in the desolate quiet of a world grappling with chaos. Long before their name was synonymous with steel, the Vons were merchants, traders with an uncanny, almost predatory instinct for opportunity. While plagues and famines swept across the land, bringing communities to their knees, the Vons saw not just despair, but a disruption in the market. They saw vacuums of power and wealth, and they moved swiftly to fill them. They bought land from the desperate, acquired businesses from the ruined, and built their foundational fortune on the ashes of others' misfortunes. This was the first, and perhaps most important, lesson passed down through their bloodline. Crisis is not a threat, but a ladder. Every rung of human suffering was a step up for them, a means to accumulate the capital that would one day reshape the world. The true genesis of the empire we know, however, began in 1811 in the smoke-choked city of Oakhaven. It was here that Arthur Vaughan, a man with his ancestors' ambition burning in his heart, took the family's mercantile wealth and sank it into a dream of fire and iron. He founded a small steel factory. This was not just any foundry. Arthur was obsessed with a new, difficult technology known as crucible steel. It was a painstaking process, demanding immense heat and precision. But it produced a metal of unparalleled qualities, stronger, purer, and more versatile than anything else available. While others saw it as a risky folly, Arthur saw the future. He poured everything into perfecting the process, believing that whoever mastered steel would master the tools of the age. His factory was more than a business. It was a declaration of intent. The Von family would no longer simply trade in the world's goods. They would create the very material from which the modern world would be built. The foundation laid by Arthur was transformed into a global fortress by his son, Edward Vaughan. Edward was a man cast from the very steel his father had perfected, hard, brilliant, and utterly uncompromising. He inherited not just a factory, but a vision, and he magnified it 1,000-fold. Edward saw that the true power of their superior steel lay not in plowshares, but in swords, or rather, in cannons. He earned the moniker the Cannon King, and it was a title he relished. Under his ruthless leadership, the Vaughan Works in Oakhaven became the arsenal of the world. His cannons were marvels of engineering, capable of firing farther and with greater accuracy than any rivals. He was a master of marketing and influence, selling his instruments of death with cold impartiality. It did not matter to him if it was a republic, a monarchy, or an empire buying his weapons. Their gold was all the same color. At the height of his reign, Von cannons were supplied to the armies of 46 different nations, often arming both sides of a conflict. Edward understood that war was the ultimate consumer. But he didn't stop there. He diversified, using his steel to build railway lines that crisscrossed continents, transporting soldiers to the front lines and carrying raw materials back to his ever-expanding factories. He had created a perfect, self-sustaining cycle of industry and conflict, with the Vaughan name at its very center. If Edward built the empire's body, it was his successor, Alistair Vaughan, who gave it a political soul. Alistair was a different breed of leader, less a man of the forge and more a creature of the drawing room. His weapons were handshakes, backroom deals, and whispered promises. He understood that industrial might was fleeting without political protection. He cultivated an intensely close relationship with the nation's most powerful financial institutions, intertwining the Vaughan fortune with the health of the national economy until it was impossible to distinguish one from the other. His greatest achievement, however, was his bond with the ambitious Emperor Kalen. The Vaughan factories were no longer just a private enterprise. They were an unofficial arm of the state. In return for unwavering loyalty and an endless supply of weaponry, the family was granted unprecedented influence over government policy, trade deals, and military contracts. The line between corporation and crown had been erased. The Vons were not just in business. They were in the business of power itself. When the Great War finally erupted, a conflict the Vons had been arming for decades, their preparations paid off on a scale that was almost unimaginable. The battlefields became a gruesome showroom for Von products. Their massive artillery pieces, nicknamed Okavind's Thunder, pulverized trenches and cities alike. Their reinforced steel plates armored the warships that ruled the seas. For the Von family, the sound of artillery fire was the ringing of a cash register. The war was a tragedy for millions, a cataclysm that tore the continent apart. But for the Vons, it was the single most profitable venture in their history. They emerged from the ashes of the conflict not weakened, but stronger and wealthier than ever before. Their fortune built upon a mountain of shell casings and broken lives. The end of the war brought a reckoning, or so it seemed. The defeated nation was shackled by the Armistice Accords, a treaty designed to dismantle its war machine. The production of heavy artillery and military hardware was strictly forbidden. For any other company, this would have been a death sentence. For the Vons, it was merely an inconvenience. Publicly, they pivoted to manufacturing tractors and industrial equipment. Secretly, in hidden workshops and through offshore subsidiaries, the design and production of advanced weaponry never stopped. They were playing a long game, waiting for the political winds to change. And they did not just wait. They actively helped to change them. Alongside another powerful industrial dynasty, the Sterling family, the Vons saw an opportunity in the simmering resentment and economic chaos of the post-war years. They began to channel a portion of their immense wealth to a radical firebrand politician, a man known as the Iron Chancellor and his burgeoning extremist party. They saw in his nationalist fervor and promises of rearmament the fastest route back to glory and profit. They financed his rallies, supported his rise, and gave him the industrial credibility he needed to seize power. They were not just betting on a horse, they were breeding a dragon, confident they could control it. When the Iron Chancellor plunged the continent into a second, even more devastating war, the Von Empire reached its zenith of power and its nadir of morality. At the helm now was Julian Von, Alistair's successor, a man who embraced the new regime's ideology with chilling enthusiasm. The Von factories became the heart of the war effort, churning out tanks, submarines, and munitions on an unprecedented scale. But this time, their profit was stained with a crime far deeper than war profiteering. The company actively participated in the regime's persecution of minorities, systematically confiscating Jewish-owned businesses and properties to expand their own industrial footprint. And they solved their labor shortages by turning to the most horrific source imaginable, human slavery. Over 55,000 people prisoners of war, political dissidents, and men, women, and children dragged from concentration camps were forced to work in Von factories. They were starved, beaten, and worked to death in horrifying conditions. Their lives treated as just another disposable raw material in the great machine of war. For Julian Von, these souls were not human beings. They were entries on a ledger, a cost-saving measure to maximize production. After the war, with the nation in ruins and the regime's horrors exposed to the world, justice finally seemed to catch up to the Von family. Julian Von was arrested and put on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming. Documents detailing the use of slave labor, testimony from the few survivors, proof of his direct complicity in the regime's atrocities. He was convicted and sentenced to a long prison term. The world watched, believing that, for once, immense wealth and power could not shield a man from the consequences of his actions. They were wrong. In 1950, in a stunning act of political expediency, Julian Von was granted a full pardon by the Allied High Commissioner. The geopolitical climate had shifted. The old enemy was now seen as a necessary buffer against a new one, and its industrial capacity needed to be rebuilt. Men like Julian Von, it was argued, were essential to that reconstruction. And so, he walked free. Not only was he pardoned, but his vast fortune and his entire industrial empire, which had been seized, were restored to him. He walked out of prison and back into the boardroom. With breathtaking speed, he rebuilt the Von Empire, once again becoming one of the most powerful and wealthiest individuals on the continent. The man who had used slaves to build weapons of conquest died a free and respected captain of industry. The message was as clear as it was terrifying. For some, justice is not a right, but a privilege that can be revoked. With enough money and the right connections, even the most monstrous of crimes could be forgiven, forgotten, and ultimately rewarded. The dynasty, however, would end not with a bang, but with a whimper. Julian's son, Nicholas Vaughan, grew up in the shadow of this dark legacy. He was the sole heir to the entire Vaughan Empire, a kingdom built on centuries of opportunism and blood. But he wanted no part of it. In an act that stunned the business world, Nicholas renounced his inheritance. He refused to carry the weight of the Vaughan name, turning his back on billions. His decision forced a transformation. In 1968, the family-owned empire, which had operated as a personal fiefdom for generations, became a public corporation. The Vaughan name was no longer attached to a single man, but to a board of directors and a sea of anonymous shareholders. Decades later, in 1997, the final chapter of the old rivalry was written. The Vaughan Corporation merged with its former competitor, the Sterling Industrial Group, the very same family that had helped them fund the Iron Chancellor. The two great industrial behemoths, whose steel had clashed on 100 battlefields, became one, Vaughan Sterling Global. Today, you will find their name not on cannons or tanks, but on elevators that lift you to the top of skyscrapers, on high-speed trains, and on advanced components inside countless everyday products. The empire never truly fell. It simply changed its clothes. The name may have faded from the headlines, but the assets, the infrastructure, and the immense wealth it generated all endure, hidden in plain sight. And this is where we find our lesson. The story of the Vaughan family is not an inspirational tale of success. It is a motivational tale of a different kind. It is a warning. It is a stark reminder that wealth is not a measure of worth, and power is not a proof of virtue. It shows us how systems of justice, even those created with the best intentions, can be bent and broken by the weight of money and influence. It teaches us that the shadows of the past are long, and that the foundations of our modern world are sometimes built upon foundations we would rather not inspect too closely. Their story is not an endpoint. It is a lesson. It is a mirror held up to our world, asking us, what shadows are we allowing to persist in our own time? Whose ambition are we fueling? And what crimes are being sanitized and rebranded before our very eyes? The motivation, then, is not to be like the Vaughans, but to be the force they never had to reckon with, a vigilant, informed, and unrelenting demand for true accountability. Their story is a call to remember, to question, and to ensure that no name, no matter how powerful, is ever allowed to place itself above humanity. What will you do to bring the shadows of your time into the light?